The damp concrete of the underground garage was slick with motor oil and fresh blood. Domenico Costello, the city's most untouchable syndicate boss, was bleeding out behind a concrete pillar, completely cornered by 10 heavily armed hitters. He had seconds to live. Then the heavy metal fire door creaked open. Standing in the dim, flickering fluorescent light wasn't a squad of heavily armored reinforcements, but Beatrice, the 300-pound waitress from the diner upstairs. And the way she racked the slide of a dead man's Glock told Domenico he was about to witness a massacre. The neon sign in the window of Sullivan's diner buzzed with a relentless, mechanical hum, casting a sickly pink glow over the linoleum floor. It was 2:00 a.m. on a Tuesday in South Boston, the kind of hour where the world stripped away its polite veneer. Behind the scratched Formica counter stood Beatrice Gallagher. Beatrice was a large woman. At 34 years old, carrying over 300 pounds on a 5'9" frame, she knew exactly how the world saw her. She was a fixture of the background, a heavily breathing piece of furniture in a stained pink apron. People didn't look at her. They looked through her. They saw the double chin, the thick arms, the broad waist that strained against the fabric of her uniform, and the sensible, thick-soled orthopedic shoes she wore to keep her arches from collapsing after 12-hour shifts. They saw a fat, tired waitress, smelling of stale coffee, deep fryer grease, and defeat. That was exactly what Beatrice wanted them to see. She poured a fresh cup of decaf for a snoring trucker in booth 3. Her movements slow, heavy, and deliberate. Every step sent a dull ache up her shins, a reminder of the sheer mass she hauled around every single day. She wiped down the counter with a bleach-soaked rag, her hazel eyes completely deadpan. Then the bell above the door chimed. The air in the diner shifted instantly. The ambient chatter of the few late-night patrons died in their throats. Even the short-order cook in the back stopped scraping the grill. Domenico Costello walked in. Domenico was a man carved from marble and violence. At 40, he was the undisputed head of the Costello Syndicate, a man who controlled the docks, the unions, and half the politicians on the eastern seaboard. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit that cost more than Beatrice's annual salary, his dark hair threaded with premature silver, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He moved with the apex predator grace of a man who knew he owned the room, flanked by 2 massive bodyguards who looked like they broke legs for cardio. He slid into his usual booth in the corner, far away from the windows, his back to the wall. Beatrice picked up a menu, grabbed a fresh carafe of black coffee, and waddled over to the booth. Her thighs chafed under her thick skirt. She didn't tremble. She didn't avert her eyes. "Evening, Mr. Costello," Beatrice said, her voice a low, raspy alto. "The usual tonight?" Domenico looked up. Unlike the businessmen who frequented the diner during the day, or the drunk college kids who stumbled in on weekends, Domenico actually looked at her. He met her eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, no subtle disgust, no dismissal. "Good evening, Beatrice," Domenico replied, his voice a rich, gravelly baritone that sent an unbidden shiver down the spine of any woman with a pulse. "Yes, please. Black coffee. The ribeye, rare, and a slice of the cherry pie if it's fresh." "Baked it 3 hours ago," she said, pouring his coffee without spilling a drop. "You look tired, Beatrice," Domenico noted softly, taking a sip. "Gravity is a harsh mistress, Mr. Costello," she replied dryly, tucking her order pad into her apron pocket. The ghost of a smile touched Domenico's lips. It was a rare expression for a man known to order executions with the same mild tone he used to order steak. "Take a break after you bring the food. Put it on my tab. My manager would have a heart attack, but I appreciate the sentiment." She lumbered back to the kitchen, acutely aware of Domenico's eyes on her back. It was a strange dynamic they shared over the past 2 years. He came in twice a week, usually late at night after concluding whatever dark business ran his empire. He always sat in her section. He always treated her with a bizarre, archaic chivalry, and he always left a $100 bill under his coffee cup. Beatrice told herself it was just the quirk of a dangerous man, but a tiny, long-buried part of her, the part that hadn't yet been crushed by grief and calories, fluttered whenever he walked through the door. 20 minutes later, she served his steak. Domenico ate in silence, checking a sleek silver watch on his left wrist. He seemed tense tonight. The casual, relaxed posture he usually maintained was tight, coiled like a spring. "Is everything all right with the steak?" she asked, pausing by his table with a pitcher of ice water. "The steak is perfect, Beatrice. The company I'm about to keep, however, leaves much to be desired," Domenico muttered, dabbing his mouth with a paper napkin. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and slid it across the table. "I have a meeting downstairs in the parking garage. If I'm not back up here in 30 minutes for my cherry pie, well, it was a pleasure knowing you. It was a tirata. It was a joke. Or it was supposed to be." But Beatrice saw the micro-expressions on his face. The slight flare of his nostrils, the tightening of the orbicularis oculi muscles around his eyes. Fear. No, not fear. Anticipation. "I'll keep it warm for you," Beatrice said. Domenico stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and nodded to his 2 bodyguards. They exited the diner, disappearing into the damp, foggy Boston night, heading toward the adjacent concrete parking structure. Beatrice watched them go. She let out a long, heavy sigh, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back. She pocketed the tip and went to clear his table. She had no idea that all hell was about to break loose beneath her feet. Level sub-3 of the adjacent parking structure was a cavernous, echoing tomb of reinforced concrete, flickering sodium vapor lights and stagnant puddles of oil. It was entirely deserted, save for a black Lincoln Navigator idling near the south elevator bank. Domenico Costello walked down the ramp, his 2 bodyguards, Paulie and Sal, flanking him closely. Their hands were buried inside their coats, gripping the handles of their firearms. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and impending violence. "I don't like this, boss," Paulie whispered, his eyes scanning the concrete pillars. "Victor Rinaldi picking this spot. It's a choke point. No easy exit." "Victor is a coward," Domenico said calmly, though his own senses were screaming at him. "He wants isolation because he's terrified of public retaliation. We hear him out, we tell him his territory ends at the river, and we leave." They approached the Navigator. The engine cut off. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. It wasn't Victor Rinaldi. It was a man named Arturo, Victor's chief enforcer, a scarred brute with a gold tooth and dead eyes. "Arturo," Domenico said, stopping 10 feet away. "Where is Victor?" Arturo smiled, a grotesque twisting of scar tissue. "Victor sends his regards, Dom. He also sends his apologies. He couldn't make it. But he wanted me to give you a message." Before Domenico could even process the trap, The screech of tires echoed through the garage. Two black, unmarked vans tore down the entrance ramp, violently cutting off the exit. The doors slid open before the vehicles even slammed to a halt. "Ambush! Weapons free!" Sal roared, pulling his weapon. 10 men poured out of the vans. They weren't street thugs holding sideways pistols. They were professionals. They wore tactical black gear, body armor, and carried suppressed submachine guns and assault rifles. Thwip, 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 thwip. The muffled, spit-like sounds of suppressed automatic fire tore through the damp air. Sal didn't even get a shot off. A burst of rounds took him in the chest and throat, throwing his massive body backward against a concrete pillar in a spray of crimson. "Get down, boss," Paulie yelled, shoving Domenico violently behind a parked concrete barrier, just as the air where Domenico's head had been was displaced by a hail of bullets. Paulie popped up, firing his heavy .45 caliber pistol. He dropped one of the tactical hitters, a hollow-point round taking the man in the unarmored face. But the return fire was overwhelming. A 3-round burst shattered Paulie's shoulder, spinning him around, followed by 2 more to his back. He collapsed, dead before he hit the oil-stained floor. Domenico was alone. He drew his own weapon, a customized Kimber 1911, and fired blindly around the edge of the barrier. He heard a grunt, but the suppressing fire was too intense. Concrete dust and sharp fragments of asphalt exploded around his face. A stray ricochet caught him in the left thigh, slicing through his suit pants and biting deep into the muscle. He gritted his teeth, swallowing a scream. Another round clipped his left shoulder, spinning him hard against the cold wall of the pillar. I was pinned, bleeding heavily, outgunned 10-1. "Flank him!" Arturo's voice barked over the echoing silence that followed the initial burst. "Spread out! Don't let him breathe. I want his head on the hood of my car." Domenico checked his magazine. 6 rounds left, 10 men closing in. He let his head fall back against the concrete, the cold seeping through his expensive wool suit. He thought of his empire, his life, the sheer absurdity of dying in a subterranean parking lot, because he underestimated Victor Rinaldi's budget for mercenaries. Upstairs, in the alley behind Sullivan's Diner, Beatrice was wrestling 3 massive, heavy-duty black trash bags into the industrial dumpster. The rain had started to drizzle, slicking her hair to her forehead and mixing with the sweat on her face. She grunted with exertion, hoisting the last heavy bag and letting it drop with a wet thud. She paused, wiping her brow with her apron, her chest heaving. She hated taking out the trash. It was a brutal reminder of her lack of stamina. Then she heard it, through the massive metal grates set into the alley floor, the ventilation shafts for the underground parking garage, came a sound that no civilian would recognize. It wasn't the loud, cinematic bang of a movie gunshot. It was a sharp, rapid, mechanical clack-hiss noise. Suppressed automatic weapons, and the unmistakable wet, heavy smack of high-velocity lead hitting meat and concrete. Beatrice froze. For 10 years, Beatrice Gallagher had been a fat, invisible waitress. But before that, she was Master Sergeant Beatrice Banshee Gallagher, a Tier 1 counter-terrorism operative for a highly classified JASOC unit. She was a close-quarters combat instructor, an urban warfare specialist, and one of the deadliest women the United States military had ever produced. She had spent 5 years hunting cartel lieutenants in the claustrophobic underground narco tunnels of Juarez and Tijuana, a mission gone catastrophically wrong had left her entire team dead. The trauma, the survivor's guilt, and the subsequent severe PTSD had broken her mind. She had accepted a quiet discharge, changed her identity, and systematically eaten herself into a new, unrecognizable body. She built a fortress of fat and apathy to ensure no one would ever look at her and see a soldier again. She just wanted to be left alone. She wanted to be invisible. But as she heard the tactical commands echoing faintly up the vent, "Flank him! Spread out!" the fortress began to crumble. She looked down through the grate. She couldn't see the shooters, but she recognized the voices, and she knew Domenico Costello was down there. The man who looked her in the eye. The man who treated her like a human being when the rest of the world treated her like a punchline. Beatrice stood completely still in the rain. Her breathing changed. The heavy, labored panting of an waitress vanished. Her respiration dropped into a slow, controlled, tactical rhythm. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. The lethargic, tired slump of her shoulders disappeared, replaced by a rigid, terrifying stillness. She turned and walked, faster than she had moved in a decade, toward her beat-up 1998 Ford Taurus parked by the alley brick wall. She opened the trunk. Beneath the spare tire, beneath a layer of old blankets and jumper cables, was a biometric steel lockbox. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. It flashed green. Inside lay the ghosts of her past. She didn't have time to gear up fully. She grabbed a customized, heavily modified combat karambit knife, slipping the retention ring over her thick index finger. Then she pulled out the main event, a Sig Sauer P226 with an extended magazine, subsonic ammunition, and a precision suppressor. She slammed the trunk shut. Beatrice walked toward the heavy steel fire door that connected the diner's basement storage to the garage's stairwell. Her orthopedic shoes made soft, squelching sounds in the puddles. She wasn't a sleek, ninja-like assassin anymore. She was over 300 pounds. She couldn't do backflips or wall runs. But she didn't need to. In close-quarters combat, speed is a luxury, but mass, leverage, and utter ruthlessness are absolute. She pulled open the fire door and stepped into the darkness of the stairwell, descending into the belly of the beast. Level sub-3 was deathly quiet, save for the dripping of water from a leaky overhead pipe and the crunch of tactical boots on shattered glass. Domenico pressed his hand hard against his bleeding thigh, his vision swimming slightly from blood loss. He could hear them spreading out, executing a perfect pincer movement. 2 coming from the left flank, 3 from the right, the rest holding the center line. It was textbook military tactics. Rinaldi had hired ex-contractors. "I know you're bleeding out, Costello," Arturo's voice taunted, echoing off the concrete. "Toss the gun. I promise I'll make it quick." Domenico tightened his grip on his kimber. He aimed at the corner of the pillar, waiting for the first shadow to cross his line of sight. He would take at least one of them to hell with him. On the far perimeter, near the shadowy elevator bank, 2 of the tactical hitters were moving in a stacked formation, sweeping their laser sights across the parked cars. They were disciplined, focused entirely on Domenico's position. They never checked their 6. They never checked the darkness behind them, because who worries about the dark when you're the monster inside it? Beatrice stepped out from behind a concrete column directly behind the rear guard. She didn't make a sound. Her thick, rubber-soled shoes absorbed her heavy footfalls completely. The rear guard, a tall man in Kevlar, shifted his weight. Beatrice didn't try to grapple him. At her size, A prolonged wrestling match would drain her stamina immediately. She relied on absolute lethal economy of motion. She stepped in tight, pressing her massive, heavy frame directly against his back, pinning his arms to his sides with her sheer body weight. Before the man could even gasp in surprise, Beatrice hooked her left arm around his forehead, yanking his head back violently, and drove the curved steel of her karambit knife deeply into the side of his neck, severing the carotid artery and the jugular vein in one brutal, singular motion. She clamped her thick, meaty hand over his mouth as the blood sprayed. She used her bulk to control his collapsing weight, riding him silently to the ground so his gear wouldn't clatter on the concrete. The point man of the two-man stack turned, confused by the sudden lack of footsteps behind him. "Hey, what?" He saw the massive silhouette of a woman crouching over his dead partner. He opened his mouth to shout, raising his rifle. Foot! Beatrice hadn't even fully stood up. She had drawn the SIG P-226 from her apron pocket and double-tapped him in the face. The subsonic rounds slammed through the bridge of his nose and his left eye socket with the sound of a heavy staple gun. The man folded backward, dropping like a puppet with its strings cut. 2 down, 8 to go. Beatrice stepped over the bodies. The smell of copper and voided bowels hit her nostrils, a scent she hadn't breathed in 10 years. A terrifying, cold clarity settled over her mind. The arthritis in her knees, the pain in her back, the crushing weight of her depression. It all vanished, replaced by the mathematical geometry of violence. She stripped a spare magazine from the dead man's chest rig, shoved it into her apron pocket next to her order pad, and moved deeper into the garage. Domenico heard the 2 muffled thuds, but he couldn't pinpoint the sound. He wiped sweat from his eyes, bracing himself. "Raptor 2, report!" Arturo's voice cracked over a comms radio on one of the dead men's vests. Static answered him. "Raptor 2, what is your status?" Arturo, standing behind the engine block of the Navigator, frowned. He looked at the 3 men holding the center line. "Sweep the south elevators, now!" 3 men broke away from the central formation, their weapons raised, tactical flashlights cutting beams through the dusty air. They moved cautiously, sweeping the rows of parked cars. Beatrice was wedged between a concrete wall and a rusted-out Chevy van. It was a tight squeeze for her massive frame, her apron smudging against the dirty metal, but the shadow hid her completely. The 3 men approached. One of their flashlight beams swept over the hood of the van, inches from her face. She waited. Patience was a predator's greatest weapon. As the first man stepped past her hiding spot, his back exposed, Beatrice reached out, grabbed the back of his tactical vest with one massive, powerful hand, and hauled him backward with the raw strength of a woman who lifted industrial kegs and carried 300 pounds of body weight daily. She slammed his skull backward into the concrete wall with a sickening crack, instantly dropping him. The other 2 men spun around in shock. Foot. Beatrice shot the second man in the throat before his rifle could clear his shoulder. The third man, panicking, pulled the trigger of his submachine gun, spraying suppressed fire wildly into the side of the Chevy van. Glass shattered. Metal tore. Beatrice didn't flinch. She simply leaned heavily against the van, using its mass as cover, extended her right arm, and put 2 rounds, center mass into his chest armor, followed immediately by a 3rd round into his unarmored groin, and a 4th into his face as he doubled over in agony. The man collapsed in a heap of tangled limbs. 5 down. The chaotic spray of gunfire from the third man had alerted the rest of the crew. "Contact! Rear flank!" one of the remaining hitters screamed. Domenico peeked around the pillar. He couldn't believe his eyes. Through the dim lighting and settling concrete dust, he saw a massive, hulking figure moving methodically through the shadows. It wasn't a SWAT team. It was a woman. She stepped into a pool of overhead light. She was wearing a stained pink waitress apron over a cheap, oversized floral skirt. Her hair, previously tied in a messy bun, had fallen loose around her thick face. She was holding a tactical handgun with a suppressor, gripping it in a flawless, modified Weaver stance. Domenico blinked, ignoring the burning pain in his leg. "Beatrice," he whispered, his brain struggling to reconcile the docile, exhausted woman who had just served him cherry pie with the angel of death systematically dismantling highly trained mercenaries. "Light her up!" Arturo roared in a panic. The remaining 5 men, including Arturo, turned their weapons away from Domenico and concentrated their fire on Beatrice. The garage erupted in a hail of suppressed gunfire. Beatrice didn't try to dive or sprint for cover. Her knees wouldn't allow it. Instead, she dropped heavily to the floor, rolling her massive bulk behind the thick, reinforced concrete base of a support column. Just as the air where she had been standing was shredded by bullets, she sat against the pillar, breathing heavily. Sweat poured down her face. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The physical exertion was immense, but her hands were rock steady. She ejected the half-empty magazine from her cig, slapped in a fresh one from her apron pocket, and racked the slide. "Who the hell is she?" one of the hitters yelled to Arturo over the gunfire. "I don't know, but kill her! Flank her!" Arturo screamed back. Beatrice closed her eyes. She visualized the geometry of the room. She knew exactly where the shooters were based on the angles of their ricochets. 3 moving left, 2 holding center. Time to go to work, she thought. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object she always carried for self-defense in the rough neighborhood. A steel-encased master lock attached to a heavy bandana. A homemade blackjack. She took a deep breath, clutching her gun in her right hand, the heavy lock in her left. "Cover me!" one of the men yelled, rushing her pillar from the left side. Beatrice waited until the exact moment his shadow crossed the edge of her vision. Instead of stepping out to shoot, she swung her left arm low, whipping the heavy steel masterlock directly into the man's kneecap. The bone shattered with a wet crunch. The man screamed, his leg collapsing under him. As he fell forward, Beatrice reached up, grabbed his tactical vest, and hauled him downward, using his own momentum and her immense upper body strength to pull him into her cover. Before he could react, she drove the butt of her pistol brutally into his temple, knocking him unconscious. She grabbed his submachine gun, a compact MP5, and checked the safety. Full auto. She hoisted herself up, leaning her back against the pillar. She didn't peek around the edge. She blindly extended the MP5 around the right side of the column and laid down a suppressing wall of fully automatic fire, chewing through the concrete where she knew the remaining 2 flanking men were advancing. Yells of pain and the sound of falling bodies told her she had connected. Suddenly, the garage fell deadly silent. The echoes faded. Domenico watched in absolute, paralyzed awe from his cover. He had commanded ruthless men his entire life. He had seen professional killers operate. But he had never seen anything like this. The sheer efficiency, the brutal, unhesitating lethality, masked in the body of a morbidly obese civilian. "Arturo!" Beatrice's voice boomed through the garage. It didn't sound like the tired, polite waitress anymore. It sounded like a demon speaking from the abyss. "You're the only one left. Drop the weapon." Silence. Then the sound of scrambling boots. Arturo wasn't stupid. He had just watched his entire elite hit squad get dismantled in under 3 minutes by a ghost in a pink apron. He broke cover, sprinting desperately for the ramp leading up to the street, abandoning Domenico entirely. Beatrice stepped out from behind the pillar. She didn't chase him. She raised her SIG P226. Took 2 seconds to align the tritium sights on Arturo's fleeing back, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. Foot. The round severed Arturo's spine right at the base of his neck. He pitched forward instantly, his body skidding across the oil-stained concrete before coming to a complete dead stop at the base of the exit ramp. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. Beatrice stood in the center of the carnage. 7 bodies lay dead or dying around her. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, copper, and exhaust. She lowered her weapon, her chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly beginning to ebb, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made her thick legs tremble. She turned slowly and looked toward the concrete barrier where Domenico Costello was bleeding. Domenico pushed himself up slightly, clutching his wounded leg, his bespoke suit ruined and soaked in his own blood. He stared at her, his dark eyes wide with shock, fear, and a strange, profound reverence. Beatrice walked over to him, her orthopedic shoes squelching in the blood on the floor. She stood over him, a massive, towering figure of death, still wearing her stained apron. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her order pad, and ripped off a piece of paper. She knelt down, a painful, awkward motion for her joints, and pressed her thumb against his bleeding shoulder wound to apply pressure. "Your cherry pie," Beatrice said softly, her chest heaving as she looked into the Mafia boss's stunned eyes, "is getting cold, Mr. Costello." Domenico Costello stared up at the massive woman looming over him, his mind reeling. The sharp scent of copper blood and the acrid sting of discharged cordite hung heavy in the damp garage air. Beatrice's breathing was ragged, her massive chest heaving under the blood-spattered pink uniform. But her hands, the hands pressing a wad of clean napkins against his torn shoulder, were as steady as a surgeon's. "Can you walk?" Beatrice asked, her voice stripped of its usual lethargic customer service drawl. It was sharp, clipped, commanding. I think so. The leg wound was a through and through," Domenico grunted, wincing as he tried to shift his weight. "Good, because at 315 pounds, I have the mass to carry you. But my knees are shot to hell, and I'm not blowing out an ACL for a mob boss," she said bluntly. She holstered her SIG P226 into the deep pocket of her apron and hauled him to his feet. Her strength was staggering. Domenico, a solidly built man of 200 pounds, felt himself lifted effortlessly as she wedged her thick shoulder under his uninjured arm. They hobbled away from the slaughterhouse, leaving the 10 elite mercenaries bleeding out on the concrete. Beatrice bypassed the main elevators, knowing the security cameras might still be looping. Instead, she dragged him toward the heavy steel fire doors leading to the diner's subterranean storage level. She punched a code into a rusted keypad, shoved the door open with her broad hip, and pulled him into the darkness. They entered the diner's basement, a sprawling, concrete-walled labyrinth of dry goods, deep freezers and metal shelving. She deposited Domenico onto a sturdy wooden prep table in the center of the room, sweeping a sack of flour to the floor to make room. Domenico hissed in pain as his leg dangled off the edge. He watched in bewildered silence as Beatrice moved through the basement. For a woman of her immense size, her economy of movement was mesmerizing. She didn't waste a single step. She waddled over to a padlocked metal locker in the corner, one marked chemical storage, and kicked the heavy master lock with the heel of her orthopedic shoe. The lock shattered. Inside wasn't bleach or degreaser. It was a matte black Pelican case. She hauled it onto the table next to him and flipped the latches. It was a fully stocked combat trauma kit, the kind used by special operations medics in hostile territory. There were Israeli bandages, quick-clot combat gauze, a staple gun, and vials of liquid that Domenico couldn't identify. "Who the hell are you?" Domenico finally rasped, his aristocratic composure cracking. "I just watched a waitress from South Boston dismantle a highly trained contractor hit squad with a kitchen knife and a Sig Sauer. Those men had tier gear. They were moving in a stacked formation." Beatrice ripped open a packet of quick clot and didn't look up. "This is going to burn like hell, Mr. Costello. Bite on this." She shoved a rolled-up leather belt into his mouth. Before he could nod, she aggressively packed the hemostatic gauze directly into the bullet hole in his shoulder. Domenico's eyes rolled back in his head. He clamped down on the belt, a muffled, guttural scream vibrating through his chest. The pain was blinding, a white-hot spike driving straight into his nervous system. "Hold still," Beatrice ordered, using her immense weight to pin his chest to the table with one arm while she worked. "I need to staple the leg." For the next 15 minutes, the basement became a makeshift trauma ward. Beatrice worked with a cold, terrifying detachment. She flushed his wounds with saline, packed them, and used a medical staple gun to close the jagged edges of flesh. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't soothe him. She operated with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this 100 times in places much worse than a Boston basement. Finally, she pulled the belt from his mouth and handed him a bottle of distilled water. Domenico took it with a trembling hand, taking a long sip. The bespoke suit he had worn was ruined, his shirt cut away, leaving him shivering in the cold basement air. He looked at Beatrice. She was sitting heavily on an overturned milk crate, wiping her bloody hands with a Clorox wipe. Sweat plastered her graying hair to her forehead. The adrenaline was fading, and he could see the profound, crushing fatigue settling back into her broad shoulders. "You didn't answer my question," Domenico said softly, his gravelly voice tight with pain. "A civilian doesn't know how to sever a carotid artery in under 2 seconds. A civilian doesn't double-tap moving targets in the dark. I know killers, Beatrice. I employ them. But you're a ghost." Beatrice tossed the bloody wipe into a trash can. She stared at the concrete floor. "My name is Master Sergeant Beatrice Gallagher," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was the first time she had spoken her rank in 10 years. "I was attached to JSOC's Task Force Orange, Intelligence Support Activity. We were the people they sent into the tunnels in Juarez when the CIA and the DEA got too scared." Domenico stared at her, absorbing the magnitude of the revelation. Task Force Orange. The absolute tip of the spear. The phantom unit that didn't officially exist on any Pentagon roster. 10 years ago, Beatrice continued, her voice hollow, devoid of emotion. My unit was ambushed in a cartel compound in Sonora. We were sold out by a high-ranking politician in D.C. My entire team was slaughtered. I was the only one who made it out. I spent 3 days crawling through the desert with a shattered femur and 2 bullets in my vest. She looked up, meeting his eyes. The hazel irises were completely dead, hollowed out by a grief too vast to articulate. When I got back to Walter Reed, I realized the government wasn't going to avenge my team. They swept it under the rug. So I took my honorable discharge. I moved to Boston. I stopped working out. I started eating. I ate until the mirror stopped showing me a soldier and started showing me a joke. I built a 300-pound wall of fat so no one would ever look at me and ask me to pull a trigger again. I just wanted to bake cherry pies and be invisible. Domenico looked at the heavy, exhausted woman sitting on the milk crate. He didn't see the fat. He didn't see the stained apron. He saw a titan. He saw a warrior who had been buried alive inside her own trauma. "You saved my life tonight, Beatrice," Domenico said, his tone shifting into something deeply respectful. "I didn't do it for you," Beatrice replied bluntly. "I did it because those assholes were making a mess in my alley, and I hate taking out the trash twice." Suddenly, a sharp, vibrating buzz broke the silence. It was coming from Beatrice's apron pocket. She reached in and pulled out a sleek, black satellite phone. She had stripped it off Arturo's body in the garage before dragging Domenico away. The caller ID glowed in the dim basement light. V. Rinaldi. Beatrice stared at the glowing screen, the name Victor Rinaldi burning into her retinas. She tossed the phone onto Domenico's chest. "Your problem is calling," she said, turning her back to him to pack up the trauma kit. Domenico picked up the phone. He didn't answer it immediately. He looked at Beatrice's broad back, a dangerous, calculating light igniting in his dark eyes. "Victor is thorough," Domenico said quietly. "If his men don't report back, he won't just assume I got lucky. He'll send a cleanup crew. They'll check the security cameras that Arturo probably hacked. They will see a massive woman in a pink apron slaughtering his elite unit. They will trace it to this diner." Beatrice froze. Her hands stopped moving over the pelican case. The cold reality of his words washed over her. "You're marked, Beatrice," Domenico said, his voice laced with grim certainty. "Victor is a paranoid psychopath. He will burn this entire block down just to make sure you're dead. Your quiet life, your invisibility. It ended the second you pulled that trigger in the garage." Beatrice slowly turned around. The lethargy was completely gone. Her jaw was set, her eyes hardening into shards of flint. "Answer the phone," she commanded. Domenico smirked, swiped the screen, and put the phone on speaker, resting it on the metal prep table. "Arturo," a slick, arrogant voice echoed from the speaker. It was Victor Rinaldi. "Tell me Costello is in a trunk." Domenico leaned forward, the pain in his shoulder temporarily forgotten. "Hello, Victor." There was a dead, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. "Domenico," Victor finally said, his voice tight. "Well, this is a surprise. I assume Arturo is no longer with us." "Arturo is currently leaking transmission fluid on sub-level 3, Domenico replied smoothly, the Mafia kingpin returning to his throne, along with the rest of your high-priced talent. You always were a cockroach, Dom, hard to kill. But you're alone. Your boys are dead. You have nowhere to run." "I don't need to run, Victor. I'm calling to tell you to get your affairs in order. By sunrise, your territory is mine." Victor laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "You're bleeding out in a hole somewhere, Dom. You don't have the manpower to touch me. I'm sitting in my estate in Brookline with 40 armed men outside my door. You're a dead man talking." The line went dead. Victor had hung up. Domenico looked up at Beatrice. "He's at the Lucchesi compound in Brookline. It's a fortress, high walls, reinforced gates, and a small army." 40 men, Beatrice muttered, doing the tactical math in her head. "Static defense. Arrogant. Probably grouped together at choke points, relying on sheer numbers rather than tactical spacing." "I can make a few calls," Domenico said, reaching for his own blood-stained cell phone. "I can rally my enforcers. We can hit him by tomorrow night." "No," Beatrice interrupted, her voice booming with sudden authority. She walked over to the prep table and slammed her meaty hands down on the metal surface. "If you call your men, there will be a street war. Cops, feds, collateral damage. It will be on the news. My face will be on the news. I will not allow that." Domenico frowned. "Then how do you propose we handle Victor?" Beatrice looked down at her thick, calloused hands. She had spent a decade trying to kill the monster inside her. She had smothered it in grease, sugar, and silence. But the monster wasn't dead. It was just well rested. And now, Victor Rinaldi was threatening to take away the only sanctuary she had left. 40 men is a platoon. "It's too many for a direct assault," Beatrice said, her mind slipping effortlessly back into the cold, calculating grooves of a JSOC tactician. "But static fortresses have a weakness. They rely on the perimeter. Once the perimeter is breached by a single, undetectable element, the inside falls apart. They won't be looking for one person. They definitely won't be looking for me." Domenico's eyes widened. "You're not seriously suggesting you go in alone?" "Beatrice, you're an incredible fighter, but you are not equipped for a siege. And respectfully, your stamina." "I'm fully aware of my physical limitations, Mr. Costello," Beatrice snapped, her tone dripping with icy confidence. "I can't run. I can't climb his walls. I can't engage in a protracted firefight, which is why I'm not going to fight them. I'm going to exterminate them." She turned and walked heavily toward a set of metal stairs leading deeper into the sub-basement. "Where are you going?" Domenico asked, trying to sit up. "To get my work clothes," Beatrice called back over her shoulder. "If I'm going to burn down a Mafia empire tonight, I'm not doing it in a skirt that smells like cheap coffee." Domenico sat in the dim light of the basement, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thud of her footsteps descending into the dark. He had walked into this diner expecting a rare steak and a quiet night. Instead, he had unwittingly awakened a dormant god of war. And as he checked the loaded magazine of his Kimber 1911, Domenico Costello realized he almost felt sorry for Victor Rinaldi. Almost. When Beatrice emerged from the sub-basement 20 minutes later, Domenico's breath caught in his throat. She was no longer the tired, shuffling waitress in a stained pink uniform. She had dressed for... Finding tactical gear for a 315-pound frame was impossible off the rack, so Beatrice had spent years modifying her own. She wore custom-tailored, reinforced Crye precision combat pants in midnight black and a heavy-duty, level 4 ceramic ballistic plate carrier that stretched across her broad chest, held together by industrial webbing. Her thick, graying hair was braided tightly against her scalp. Strapped to her right, massive thigh was a custom Kydex holster holding a massive H&K Mark 23.45 caliber pistol. But it was the weapon she carried in her thick hands that made Domenico's blood run cold. An integrally suppressed, short-barreled M110 semi-automatic sniper system. She looked like a walking, heavily armored tank. She was slow, she was massive, and she was entirely unstoppable. "I secured the diner doors," Beatrice said, her voice a low, mechanical rumble. She tossed Domenico a cheap, prepaid flip phone. "Keep pressure on that leg. If I'm not back by 5:00 a.m., call your cleaner, burn this place down, and disappear." "Beatrice," Domenico said, struggling to sit up on the metal prep table. He reached out, his blood-stained hand gripping her thick, Kevlar-covered forearm. The sheer mass of her was intoxicating to a man who spent his life surrounded by fragile things. "Victor's men are ex-Constellis contractors. They are highly paid and heavily armed. Please, do not underestimate them." Beatrice looked down at his hand, then up into his dark, desperate eyes. The intense, simmering connection between them was no longer hidden behind diner menus and polite banter. "They're mercenaries, Domenico," she said softly, a predatory smirk touching her lips. "They fight for a paycheck. I'm fighting for my peace and quiet. I'll be back for my cherry pie." She turned and lumbered out of the basement. The Lucchese compound in Brookline sat on 4 acres of pristine Massachusetts real estate, surrounded by a 12-foot wrought-iron fence and perimeter cameras. It was 3:15 a.m. The rain had intensified into a torrential downpour, masking the sound of Beatrice's 1998 Ford Taurus rolling to a stop 2 blocks away. She didn't attempt to scale the wall. She didn't have the knees for it. Instead, she popped the trunk of her car and pulled out a heavy, matte black helmet equipped with GPNVG-printed panoramic night vision goggles, the exact 4-tube optics used by SEAL Team 6. She strapped the helmet over her braided hair and pulled down the visor. The world shifted into a hyper-clear, glowing green landscape. From the trunk, she also retrieved a suppressed, hydraulic breaching spreader. The jaws of life used by elite fire rescue units, modified for silent tactical entry. Carrying 70 pounds of gear, Beatrice moved with a slow, deliberate, punishing rhythm through the pouring rain. She approached the heavily guarded rear utility gate of the estate. 2 men in rain ponchos stood on the other side, smoking cigarettes, completely oblivious to the shadow standing just beyond the iron bars. Beatrice raised the M110. The heavy rifle stabilized perfectly against her massive shoulder. Her sheer weight absorbed the weapon's recoil like a sponge. Foot! Foot! 2 subsonic 175-grain hollow-point rounds punched through the rain. The 2 guards dropped silently into the manicured mud, their central nervous systems instantly severed. Beatrice wedged the hydraulic spreader between the iron bars of the gate. She hit the activation switch with a low, metallic groan, completely masked by the thunder. The heavy iron bent and snapped. She stepped through the breach. Victor Rinaldi felt safe inside his fortress. He was sitting in his mahogany-paneled office on the 2nd floor, sipping an expensive glass of Macallan 25, waiting for his phone to ring with the confirmation of Domenico's death. He had 40 men patrolling the grounds. He was untouchable. Then the lights went out. Every bulb in the mansion, every floodlight on the lawn, died instantly. "Generator!" Victor yelled into the darkness. "Get the backup generator on!" Outside, Beatrice stood next to the compound's primary transformer and the backup diesel generator. Both were smoking, completely destroyed by two carefully placed thermite charges. In the pitch black, the Constellis contractors were blind. They scrambled, clicking on weapon-mounted flashlights, their beams cutting frantically through the pouring rain. But flashlights are just targets for someone who can see in the dark. Through her panoramic night vision, Beatrice saw the courtyard light up with glowing thermal signatures. She didn't run. She didn't take cover. She simply planted her thick, heavy orthopedic boots into the mud, raised her rifle, and went to work, foot, foot, foot. She moved like a methodical grim reaper, her massive form blending perfectly into the storm. A flashlight beam would flick on, and a millisecond later, the man holding it would drop dead, a heavy caliber round through his Kevlar helmet. She cleared the courtyard in 4 minutes. 14 men dead. She hadn't even broken a sweat. Her slow, rhythmic pacing kept her heart rate completely stable. She approached the heavy oak front doors of the mansion. Inside the grand foyer, 6 heavily armed men were taking up defensive positions behind marble pillars, their weapons trained on the front door. They were terrified. The radio chatter from the courtyard had gone completely, horrifyingly dead. "Hold the line," the squad leader barked. "Whatever it is, it has to come through that door." He was wrong. Beatrice knew her mass was her greatest weapon in close quarters. She didn't bother with the door. She pulled a slab of C4 explosive from her tactical vest, slapped it directly over the deadbolts of the heavy oak doors, pushed a detonator pin into the putty, and took 3 heavy steps back. Boom! The explosion shattered the mansion's windows, blowing the massive doors entirely off their hinges. Wood splinters and thick smoke filled the foyer. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, a 300-pound juggernaut stepped through the breach. The mercenaries opened fire, a deafening roar of automatic weapons. Sparks flew as rounds impacted the heavy level 4 ceramic plates strapped to Beatrice's chest and stomach. She grunted as the kinetic force hit her, the impacts feeling like brutal punches, but her immense weight and low center of gravity kept her rooted to the marble floor. She didn't fall. She didn't even stumble. She dropped the M110 to its sling, drew the massive H&K Mark 23 pistol, and fired with terrifying mechanical precision. Bang, bang, bang. Unsuppressed, the .45 caliber hand cannon roared like a dragon in the enclosed space. She took down the squad leader with a shot to the throat. She pivoted, the sheer momentum of her thick torso carrying the heavy gun toward the next target, blowing a hole through a mercenary's chest plate. In under 10 seconds, the foyer was silent. Beatrice ejected the empty magazine, slapped in a fresh one, and began the slow, heavy climb up the grand, sweeping staircase. Her knees screamed in agony. Her lungs burned. The arthritis in her lower back flared with a blinding intensity. But she didn't stop. She took it one heavy, wet step at a time. Upstairs, Victor Rinaldi was hyperventilating. He was backed into the corner of his opulent office, a gold-plated revolver trembling in his hands. He could hear the heavy, thudding footsteps echoing down the hallway. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like a monster from a nightmare. The mahogany doors to his office didn't open. They splintered as a massive, heavy boot kicked them perfectly at the locking mechanism. Beatrice stepped into the room. She was covered in drywall dust, rain, and blood. Her Kevlar vest was pockmarked with bullets that had failed to penetrate. She pushed the night vision goggles up onto her helmet, revealing her deadpan, hazel eyes. Victor stared at her, his mind shattering. "You," Victor gasped, lowering his gun in pure, unadulterated shock. You're the waitress from Sullivan's." Beatrice took a slow, heavy breath, resting her thick finger on the trigger of her H&K. "My shift ended an hour ago, Victor," she rumbled. Victor raised his revolver, screaming in terror. Beatrice didn't flinch. She simply raised her pistol and fired once. The heavy .45 caliber slug took Victor perfectly between the eyes. He slammed backward against his mahogany bookshelf, dead before his body hit the imported Persian rug. Beatrice let out a long, shuddering breath. She holstered her weapon. The adrenaline began to crash, leaving her body feeling like it was made of lead. The arthritis in her knees was a white-hot fire. But the mission was complete. The ghost was satisfied. An hour later, the heavy metal door to Sullivan's diner sub-basement creaked open. Domenico Costello was still sitting on the metal prep table. He had managed to find a clean white chef's coat to drape over his bare, heavily bandaged shoulders. Beatrice lumbered down the stairs. She had stripped off the ballistic vest and the helmet. She was just a large, exhausted woman in heavy combat pants and a black sweater. She looked utterly drained. She waddled over to the sink, turned on the cold water, and began scrubbing the blood and gunpowder from her thick, calloused hands. Domenico watched her. The silence between them was thick, electric, and profoundly intimate. "Victor?" Domenico asked softly. "Retired," Beatrice replied dryly, shutting off the faucet. She grabbed a paper towel and dried her hands. "His entire security detail is either dead or fleeing the state. You have your city back, Mr. Costello." She turned to face him, expecting him to leave, expecting him to call his men, clean up the mess in the garage, and never look at the fat, broken waitress again. Instead, Domenico slid awkwardly off the prep table, ignoring the blinding pain in his stapled leg. He limped over to her. He didn't stop until he was mere inches away, completely dwarfed by her massive, imposing frame. He looked up into her weary, beautiful hazel eyes. He didn't see a 300-pound civilian. He saw a queen. He saw the most magnificent, terrifying, and utterly captivating woman he had ever met in his life. Domenico reached up with his uninjured arm. Gently, reverently, he cupped Beatrice's thick, soft cheek. Beatrice's breath hitched. She froze. For 10 years, she had pushed everyone away. She had hidden behind a wall of flesh and apathy. But Domenico's touch was warm, firm, and entirely devoid of judgment. "You told me you built this life to be invisible, Beatrice," Domenico whispered, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "But from the first night I walked into this diner, you are the only thing in this city I have ever truly seen." A single tear broke loose from Beatrice's eye, cutting a clean path through the gunpowder residue on her cheek. Domenico leaned in and pressed his lips firmly against hers. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was deep, bruising, and filled with the dark, violent passion of two apex predators recognizing their mate. Beatrice's massive hands reached up, tentatively at first, before gripping the lapels of his borrowed coat, pulling him tight against her soft, formidable body. When they finally broke apart, Domenico rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily in the cold basement air. "I have a city to rebuild tomorrow," Domenico murmured, a dark smile playing on his lips. "I'm going to need a partner, someone who knows how to hold the line." Beatrice let out a low, rumbling chuckle, the sound vibrating through her chest. She looked into the eyes of the Mafia kingpin, the ghost of the banshee finally merging with the woman she had become. "I can do that," Beatrice said softly. "But first, I believe you ordered a slice of cherry pie." Beatrice and Domenico's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always wrapped in a conventional package. Society taught Beatrice to hide her trauma behind a wall of invisibility, judging her solely by her weight. But when the fire came, she proved that the spirit of a warrior never truly dies. It just waits for a reason to wake up. Domenico didn't fall for a stereotype. He fell for the unstoppable, lethal, and fiercely loyal titan she truly was. They conquered their demons, and then they conquered the city. Did this gritty, action-packed romance leave you on the edge of your seat? If you loved Beatrice's unstoppable transformation and Domenico's dark devotion, hit that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who loves a fiercely unconventional heroine. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling tale. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Beatrice's rampage? See you in the next video.